She saw him too late, and by then, walking away would have been easier. The man sat slumped on the bus stop bench, snow gathering on his shoulders, breath breaking into thin, uneven clouds like it might stop at any second. People passed without slowing down. They always did. Naomi Carter stood there, her fingers tightening around the only warm thing she owned. A faded gray sweater stretched thin at the elbows, and felt the cold already creeping through her bones. Giving it up meant going home with nothing. No warmth, no food, no margin for mistakes. People like her didn't get to be reckless with survival. The wind cut sharper. The man didn't move. Naomi closed her eyes for half a second, then pulled the sweater over her head and stepped toward him, not knowing this one decision would follow her all the way back into the richest house in the city. The man looked up slowly, not with the wild panic Naomi expected, but with a strange, exhausted stillness, like someone too cold to perform pride anymore. Snow clung to the dark wool of his coat, expensive once maybe, now wet through and dull under the streetlight. Up close, she noticed details that didn't fit. His hands were clean despite the dirt at his cuffs, his posture too straight even while shivering, and there was a pale line on his wrist where a watch had clearly been not long ago. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough, low, controlled even in weakness. "You should keep that." Naomi almost laughed at that, because the sweater had already left her shoulders, and the wind was slicing through her thin work blouse like it had teeth. "I'll live," she said, though the words trembled on the way out. "You won't. Not sitting here like this." She crouched in front of him, rubbing warmth back into his stiff fingers with both hands. His skin felt like ice, the kind that scared you because it no longer felt human. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the last thing she had besides bus fare. A crumpled $5 bill she had meant to stretch into dinner and breakfast. For half a second, her thumb held on. Hunger makes everything feel heavier, even kindness. Then she pressed the bill into his palm. "There's a coffee cart a block over if it's still open," she whispered. "Get something hot, and stay where the lights are." He stared at the money, then at her face, as if trying to understand what kind of world still produced people like her. Most nights, Naomi felt invisible. Another black maid in a city full of polished glass and locked doors. Someone trusted to clean luxury but never belonged near it. Yet here, in the blowing snow, a stranger was looking at her like she had just returned something he thought the world had lost. "What's your name?" he asked. Naomi hesitated, then stood, hugging her arms tight against the cold already creeping into her bones. "Naomi," she said. "Naomi Carter." His eyes stayed on her, clear despite the exhaustion now, almost too clear. "Thank you, Naomi Carter." The way he said it landed strangely careful, deliberate, like he was committing it to memory instead of conversation. She gave a small nod, stepped back from the bench, and turned toward the sidewalk. Behind her, the wind rose harder, carrying snow across the empty street. But for the first time all night, the man pulled the sweater tight around himself and sat up a little straighter. The walk home felt twice as long without the sweater. Snow kept catching in Naomi's braids, melting against her scalp, then turning cold again as the wind pushed harder down the avenue. By the time she climbed the 3 cracked steps to her building, her fingers were so numb she missed the keyhole twice. The hallway smelled like radiator dust and old cooking oil. Familiar, tired, poor in the way only old buildings could be. Inside her studio apartment, the air wasn't much warmer. The small radiator by the window knocked and hissed, giving off more noise than heat. Naomi shut the door behind her, leaned against it for a moment, and closed her eyes. Her whole body shook now. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in those small, uncontrollable tremors that come when cold gets deep enough to settle inside your bones. She peeled off her damp coat, hung it carefully on the back of a chair, and crossed the room in silence. The place was barely 12 feet wide. A twin bed, a sink with 2 chipped mugs beside it, a hot plate near the wall, and a folding table covered with unopened bills. The kind of room people called temporary when they had never spent a winter in one. Naomi filled the kettle halfway and set it on the burner. No tea bag tonight, just hot water because that was all she had left. Her stomach tightened at the smell of nothing. She had given away dinner, breakfast, and the only warm thing she owned in the same 5 minutes. And somehow the hardest part wasn't the hunger. It was wondering whether the man had stayed awake long enough to use what she gave him. She sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed her hands together, watching the steam begin to whisper from the kettle. In the dark window above the sink, her reflection looked thinner than she remembered, shoulders drawn in, collarbones sharp beneath the blouse she wore under her uniform. People always praised women like Naomi for being strong, when what they really meant was that they had watched her endure things no one should have to endure and found it convenient. She rose, poured the hot water into one of the chipped mugs, and wrapped both palms around it. The heat stung so sharply it almost hurt, but she welcomed it. Outside, snow drifted past the glass in slow white ribbons. Somewhere down the block, a siren wailed and faded. Somewhere else, a door slammed. Then the city returned to that particular winter silence that never felt peaceful, only distant. Naomi took one sip, then another, and let herself breathe. She had no idea who the man was, no idea where he had come from, or why his voice had sounded too polished for the street, or why his thank you had carried the weight of a promise. But she knew this much. If she had walked away, she would not have slept at all. Some people survive by holding tight to what little they have. Naomi survived by refusing to become as cold as the world around her. A little after midnight, she lay down fully dressed beneath a thin blanket, curled toward the wall for warmth. Her stomach ached. Her hands were still red from the cold. Yet just before sleep took her, one thought returned. The way he had said her name, Naomi Carter. Like losing it was no longer an option. Morning arrived gray and sharp, the kind of cold that didn't fade with daylight, only settled deeper into the bones. Naomi kept her head down as she moved through the Whitmore estate, hands steady, motions precise. Exactly the way they needed to be. Routine had always been her shield. Predictable, invisible, safe. But today, something felt off. Not in the house itself, it was still immaculate, still silent, still controlled. But in the way silence lingered a second too long. In the way footsteps seemed to echo behind her even when no one was there. She felt it before she saw him. Grant Whitmore stood at the far end of the corridor, not blocking her path. Just watching. Not openly. Not accusing. But not looking away either. Naomi lowered her gaze and kept walking. That was the rule. Don't engage. Don't invite attention. But awareness sharpened under her skin with every step she took past him. Like the air itself had turned colder. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. Because silence, in a house like this, was never empty. It observed, measured, decided. Naomi reached the service room and exhaled quietly, only then realizing how tightly she had been holding her breath. It shouldn't matter. She had done nothing wrong. At least nothing anyone here could prove. But the weight of last night hadn't left her. Clung, subtle, persistent, like something unfinished. The missing sweater, the empty pocket, the memory of a man whose breath had almost disappeared into the snow. Naomi forced her focus back into her work, scrubbing, folding, aligning everything exactly as expected. Precision was protection. Mistakes were noticed, and being noticed was dangerous. Time passed, but not cleanly. Every movement felt watched, every small sound louder than it should have been. When she stepped back into the main hallway, she saw him again. Closer this time. No glass in his hand now. No distraction. Just attention, direct, deliberate. "Cold morning," Grant said casually, though nothing about his tone felt casual. Naomi nodded once. "Yes, sir." She kept her voice even, neutral, the way it had to be. His eyes moved, not quickly, not obviously, but enough. Over her shoulders. Her hands. The space where warmth should have been. "You don't seem dressed for it," he added. Naomi didn't respond right away, because answering meant acknowledging. And acknowledging meant opening a door she couldn't close again. "I'm fine," she said finally. Grant held her there with nothing more than his gaze. No accusation. No proof. Just pressure. The kind that built slowly, quietly, until it became impossible to ignore. "You left the house last night," he said. Not a question. Naomi's pulse tightened, but her expression didn't shift. "Yes, sir." A pause stretched between them, long enough to feel deliberate. Without permission. Still calm. Still controlled. Naomi didn't correct him, because correcting him would mean explaining, and explaining would mean choosing between truth and everything she stood to lose. "It won't happen again," she said. The words sounded right, safe, practiced, but something in them felt fragile, even to her own ears. Grant studied her a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, as if the answer was acceptable, as if the moment had passed. But it hadn't. Naomi could feel that much, because as she turned to leave, his voice came again. Quiet, precise. "People who break rules in this house," he said, "usually have something they're trying to hide." Naomi stopped, just for a second. Not long enough to be obvious, but long enough for something inside her to tighten. Then she kept walking, because stopping longer would mean giving him something real. And right now, uncertainty was the only thing protecting her. Behind her, Grant didn't move, didn't follow, but his attention stayed exactly where it had been, fixed, patient, unrelenting. And for the first time since the snow had fallen the night before, Naomi understood something clearly. What she had done outside might have saved someone, but inside this house it had changed everything. Because here, kindness wasn't invisible. It left traces, and traces had a way of being found, even when they should have stayed buried, even when they should have disappeared into the cold, even when they should have remained exactly where she had left them. Forgotten, unseen, and buried in the snow. The uneasy feeling proved real a little before 11:30. Not all at once, but in the way small things stopped aligning. Conversations cut off too quickly when Naomi entered a room. A glance lingered half a second longer than it should have. Even the usual rhythm of the house, the quiet choreography of staff moving unseen, felt disrupted, like something invisible had shifted beneath it. Naomi kept her focus on her work, but awareness pressed in from all sides now. Not imagined, not subtle anymore, real. The service corridor carried whispers she couldn't fully hear, only feel low, cautious, unfinished. Someone knew something, or thought they did. And in a house like this, suspicion didn't stay small for long. By the time she reached the kitchen, the tension had thickened into something harder to ignore. 2 staff members fell silent when she stepped inside. One of them avoided her eyes completely. The other looked too quickly, then away. Naomi said nothing. She didn't ask. Questions created attention. Attention created risk. And right now, risk was already too close. She moved to her station, hands steady, breathing controlled, repeating the motions she trusted. Wash, dry, place, align. Precision was the only thing she still had control over. But even that began to slip when the head supervisor entered. Not rushed, not loud, just present in a way that pulled every thread tighter. "We have a situation," the supervisor said, voice clipped, controlled. Not panic. Worse, order. Naomi didn't look up, but her pulse shifted anyway. A situation meant review. Review meant questions. Questions meant exposure. "Money is missing," the supervisor continued. The words landed clean, sharp, deliberate, no accusation attached. Yet, but they didn't need one. The room already knew where to look. Naomi felt it, not in what anyone said, but in what no one did. No one defended. No one reacted. Silence spread, heavy and expectant. She kept working, because stopping would confirm something she hadn't been accused of, but had already been placed inside. "All staff who worked last night will be accounted for," the supervisor added. Naomi's hands slowed for half a second, then continued. Too controlled, too precise, like someone holding the line just long enough not to break. This was how it happened. Not loud, not sudden, quiet, systematic. A narrowing of space until there was nowhere left to stand. Footsteps echoed from the main hall, different from the usual flow. Slower, measured, Not staff. Not routine. The kind of presence that shifted the entire room without needing to announce itself. Conversations stopped entirely this time. Not tapered. Not softened. Stopped. Naomi didn't turn. She didn't need to. The air changed first. Then the silence settled into something absolute. Someone important had arrived. The supervisor straightened slightly, posture adjusting almost unconsciously. "Sir," they said. One word. Enough to confirm everything Naomi had already felt building since morning. Grant Whitmore had entered the room. Naomi's chest tightened. Not outwardly, not enough for anyone to see, but enough to make each breath more deliberate than it should have been. This wasn't coincidence anymore. Not observation. Not suspicion. This was movement. Direct. Intentional. Grant didn't speak immediately. His gaze moved across the room slowly, deliberately, not searching for something, but confirming what he already knew. Naomi felt it before it reached her. The weight of it. The focus. When his eyes finally stopped, the room followed. No one turned their heads. No one needed to. Attention had already aligned around the same point. Around her. Grant stepped forward once, then stopped. Close enough now that distance no longer protected anything. "I'm looking," he said, his voice calm, controlled, too controlled, for Naomi Carter. For a moment, no one moved. Not Mrs. Abernathy, not the footmen, not the assistants hovering near the study doors with their expensive silence and polished shoes. Naomi felt every eye in the foyer turn toward her at once, and attention, she had learned, could feel colder than weather when it came from the wrong people. Her hands tightened around the cart handle until the metal pressed crescents into her palms. Ethan Whitmore took another step forward, slower this time, as if he understood that the room had become dangerous in a different way now. Not with violence, but with hierarchy, assumption, and the sharp humiliation of being recognized where you were only supposed to serve. Mrs. Abernathy recovered first. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully, "if there has been some misunderstanding involving a member of staff, I can handle it privately." His gaze did not leave Naomi. "There is no misunderstanding," he said, quiet, precise, final. The house manager's face held steady, but Naomi saw the change in it anyway. That tiny tightening around the mouth wealthy people wore when they realized the script had slipped out of their hands. Mr. Holloway cleared his throat. "Sir, the guests for the brunch are due in 20 minutes. Ethan answered without looking at him. "Then they can wait." The words landed softly, yet the entire foyer seemed to absorb them like a command carved into stone. Naomi could feel her heartbeat in her throat now. Yesterday he had been hunched beneath snow with her sweater around his shoulders. And now he stood under crystal light, every inch the man this house had been built to impress. It should have made the moment easier to understand. Instead it made it stranger, because the man in the snow had looked breakable, and the man before her looked like he had not been breakable a single day in his life. "Naomi," he said again, and hearing her first name in his voice. Not rushed, not careless, not swallowed by status. Unsettled her more than the SUVs had. She glanced once at Mrs. Abernathy, once at Lorna standing frozen in the side hall, then back at him. "I'm here," she said. Her voice came out soft, but it did not shake. Ethan's eyes moved over her face with that same deliberate stillness from the bus stop, then lowered again, briefly, to the open line of her coat where the missing sweater should have been. Regret passed through his expression so quickly another person might have missed it. Naomi didn't. It wasn't pity. That would have insulted her. It was something heavier, the shock of a man discovering the cost of kindness after he had already accepted it. He reached behind him, and one of the security men stepped forward with a dark garment bag and a small cream-colored box. The gesture alone made half the room inhale. Naomi stayed perfectly still. Ethan took the box himself. "You gave me something last night," he said. "Something you could not afford to give." Mrs. Abernathy blinked, confusion now overtaking control. Mr. Holloway lowered his phone at last. Lorna's hand rose slowly to her mouth. Naomi felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from pride but from exposure. Poverty was easier to survive when it remained private. There was dignity in being unseen, until the wrong kind of witnessing turned your sacrifice into a spectacle. Ethan seemed to sense that too, because when he spoke again, his voice dropped lower, meant more for her than the room. "I won't embarrass you," he said, "but I need to say this where they can hear it. Because they should." He looked around the foyer then, not with anger, but with an authority so clean it made everyone else look temporary. "Last night," he said, "while most of this city drove past me, this woman stopped. She gave me her only sweater, and the last cash she had in her pocket. She did not know my name. She did not ask for anything. She just saw someone in trouble and chose not to become as cold as the world around her." Silence followed, the kind that reveals more than noise ever can. Naomi stared at the marble floor because looking at any face in that moment would have been too much. She could almost feel the entire house rearranging itself around a truth no one had budgeted for, that the person with the least in the room had been the one carrying the most humanity. Ethan set the cream-colored box on the foyer table beside the orchids. Then, carefully, with both hands, he opened the garment bag. Her sweater was inside, washed, dried, and folded with an almost unbearable neatness. Even from several feet away, Naomi could see one elbow had been mended where the knit had started to fray. Someone had repaired it. Repaired her old sweater as if it mattered. The sight hit her harder than the black SUVs, harder than hearing his name, harder than any apology could have. Because money could replace a coat in 10 minutes. But only respect would notice which sweater had been worn thin by years. Ethan lifted it out and held it as though it were not faded fabric but evidence. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. Naomi finally looked up at him fully. The foyer, the chandelier, the guests who would soon arrive, Mrs. Abernathy's rigid posture, the polished silver waiting in the dining room. All of it seemed to drift to the edges. There are moments when a person is seen so clearly it feels almost unbearable. Not because they are exposed, but because they are finally understood. Naomi stepped forward once, then stopped. "You fixed it," she said, barely above a whisper. Ethan's expression changed then, just enough to show the man from the snow beneath the billionaire's composure. "It was torn," he said. "It shouldn't have stayed that way." And something in Naomi's chest, held tight since the bus stop, since the freezing night, since the long morning of being corrected and contained, loosened all at once. Naomi reached for the sweater with both hands, slowly, almost reverently, as if sudden movement might break the fragile logic of the moment. The wool felt warmer than it should have, softened by careful washing. The repaired elbow stitched in a thread so closely matched she almost missed it. Her fingertips paused over that small mend. It was such a tiny thing. A patch no one wealthy would ever need to notice on their own clothing, yet someone had noticed it on hers. Someone had decided it was worth preserving. Naomi swallowed hard. "Thank you," she said, and those two words carried more strain than a longer speech ever could. Ethan gave a slight nod, but his eyes stayed on her face, attentive in a way that did not crowd her. Around them, the room remained still. Not the relaxed stillness of a beautiful home, but the tense, listening kind that comes when a truth has entered and no one knows how to return to pretending. Mrs. Abernathy stood near the foyer table with her hands clasped tightly enough to whiten the knuckles. Mr. Holloway had gone pale in that controlled corporate way people did when they sensed the balance of a room tilting away from them. Lorna looked proud and a little heartbroken, as if she had spent years watching Naomi survive on too little and was only now seeing someone important recognize the cost. Ethan glanced toward the cream-colored box still resting beside the orchids. "There's more," he said quietly. Naomi's first instinct was immediate and instinctive. "You don't have to." He looked back at her, and for the first time since stepping into the foyer, something like weary honesty softened the edges of his authority. "I know I don't," he said. "That's the point." He opened the box himself. Inside was a new sweater. Ivory, simple, expensive without trying to prove it, the kind of cashmere most people only touched on store mannequins or in magazines left in waiting rooms. No flashy label turned outward, no performative grandeur, just warmth, chosen with restraint. Naomi stared at it, then at him. "I can't take that." "Yes, you can. Mr. Whitmore?" She stopped, aware suddenly of how many ears were leaning toward them even in silence. She lowered her voice. "I didn't help you for this. I know." He said it so quickly, so cleanly, that her resistance faltered for a beat. "And if I thought you had, I wouldn't be standing here." His gaze shifted briefly toward the room around them. "Some gifts are transactions. What you did wasn't. That's why this matters." Naomi looked down at the folded cashmere again. It was beautiful, yes. But beauty had never been the dangerous thing. Obligation was dangerous. Debt was dangerous. In Naomi's world, free things often arrived carrying invisible strings, and women like her paid for them later in dignity, in assumptions, in whispered judgments behind polished doors. Ethan seemed to understand that hesitation too. "You owe me nothing," he said. "Not a conversation, not gratitude, not a performance. Last night you gave warmth to a stranger. This morning, I'm returning it properly." The last word hung there with quiet weight. Properly. As if he knew that what stung most was not the cold itself, but the fact that she had walked into this house half frozen and no one had asked why. Naomi lifted her eyes to his again. There it was, the second truth beneath the first. He wasn't only thanking her. He was indicting the room. Not cruelly, not theatrically, but in a way even more unsettling to everyone present. By simply seeing her clearly, he had revealed how long others had chosen not to. Mrs. Abernathy drew one measured breath. "Mr. Whitmore, perhaps Miss Carter would be more comfortable if this were handled in the office." Naomi felt the old instinct rise at once. Make it smaller, move it out of sight, return the story to a room where hierarchy could be restored and humanity translated into paperwork. But Ethan did not even turn. "No," he said, "just that. One syllable, steady as a locked door." Then, after a beat, he added, "Comfort has not been the standard used for her this morning. I see no reason to introduce it now for the sake of appearances." The sentence landed like winter sunlight on glass. Bright, cold, impossible to argue with. Mrs. Abernathy did not answer. Naomi's chest tightened. It wasn't revenge she felt. She didn't want the woman humiliated. What she felt was stranger. The ache of watching fairness arrive late, when your body had already learned to live without expecting it. Ethan held the new sweater toward her. This time, after a long pause, Naomi took it. The cashmere was impossibly soft, a fabric so gentle it almost startled her. Her hands, reddened from cheap cleaners and cold bus stops, looked out of place against it. "It's too much," she said softly. "No," Ethan replied. "Too much was you standing in this house all morning without the thing you gave away, while people with full closets discuss standards." The words did not rise. They did not need to. Somewhere near the staircase, one of the assistants looked down at his shoes. Lorna blinked hard and busied herself with the napkins she was no longer folding. Naomi's throat tightened again. She thought of the hot water in a chipped mug, the radiator that knocked more than it warmed, the $5 bill she had pressed into a stranger's frozen hand knowing it would leave her hungry. None of that had felt noble in the moment. It had just felt necessary. That was the secret the world never understood about kindness from poor people. It was rarely grand. It was usually just one suffering person refusing to let another suffer alone. Ethan stepped closer then, not enough to invade, just enough to lower his voice beneath the chandelier's listening silence. "I left the office last night after a bored dinner," he said. "My car stalled 3 blocks from the avenue. My phone battery died. Security lost track of me in the storm." Naomi listened, still holding both sweaters now, the old one folded over one arm, the new one gathered lightly in her hands. "I kept walking because I thought I could outlast the weather." A dry, almost humorless breath touched the edge of his next words. "Turns out money teaches people many things, but not how cold a city can become when no one recognizes you." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. "I recognized you," she said, then shook her head gently. "Not your name, just that you were in trouble." Something moved in his face then, something unguarded enough to make him seem briefly closer to the man on the bench than the billionaire in the foyer. "Exactly," he said. "That's what no one else did." The front doors remained open just enough to let in a ribbon of cold air. Beyond the glass, more cars waited. Inside, the marble gleamed, the orchids stood perfect in their vase, and the scent of pastries still drifted from the dining room where wealthy guests would soon arrive expecting hospitality polished smooth enough to hide the labor beneath it. Yet the emotional center of the house had shifted completely. It was no longer in the silver service or the guest list or the business scheduled upstairs. It was here, in a maid's worn hands, in a mended sweater, in the unbearable simplicity of a rich man forced to confront who had saved him when all the visible signs of his importance were gone. Naomi looked down once more at the new sweater. Then, carefully, she placed the old one against her chest and draped the cashmere over her arm. She was still deciding what acceptance meant, still protecting the private dignity of her own motives, but she was no longer hiding from the truth of what had happened either. "I need to get back to work," she said at last, because it was the only sentence she trusted not to break inside. Ethan studied her for a beat. Then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, he gave the smallest nod, as if work done by her hands deserved the same gravity as anything on his calendar. "Then I'll walk with you," he said, and the entire foyer seemed to stop breathing all over again. Naomi did not argue, mostly because she no longer trusted her voice to stay steady beneath the weight of so many eyes. She turned toward the service corridor with the old sweater held close against her chest and the new one folded over her arm like something borrowed from a life she had never imagined touching. Ethan Whitmore fell into step beside her without hesitation. Not ahead of her, not behind her, beside her. That, more than the SUVs or the cashmere or the stunned silence in the foyer, unsettled the house. Mrs. Abernathy remained near the orchids, frozen in the posture of someone who had spent years organizing every room she entered and had just discovered that order could be broken by a single act of decency. As Naomi walked, staff members moved out of the way instinctively. The hallway that normally absorbed women like her without acknowledgement now seemed to notice every sound she made. The soft squeak of her work shoes, the faint rustle of wool against her coat, the quiet breath she kept drawing carefully so she would not let emotion rush past dignity. In the service pantry, Lorna was still standing by the pressed linens when they entered. Her eyes widened once more, but this time there was no confusion in them, only vindication. Naomi set the housekeeping rag on the counter with more care than it deserved, needing something ordinary to touch. Ethan paused near the doorway, taking in the narrow room, the industrial shelves, the chipped mug by the sink, the coat. Hooks crowded with practical things no one glamorous ever wore. The contrast did not seem lost on him. "This is where you work from?" he asked quietly. Naomi glanced back over one shoulder. "This is where all of us work from." His eyes moved across the space again, and she saw that land too. Not me. All of us. It mattered to her that he understand the difference. One good deed returned did not erase the architecture of who got overlooked and who didn't. Ethan nodded once. "Then I've been looking at the wrong parts of my own house." Naomi almost answered, then didn't. There were some truths too large to reward quickly. Instead, she set both sweaters down on the edge of the counter and reached for the silver polish she still needed for the east dining room. Habit is a strange thing. Even after a morning like this, her body still moved toward unfinished work. Ethan watched her hand close around the bottle and seemed to understand something else then. That survival had taught her not to assume emotional moments paid the rent. "Naomi," he said, low and direct, "you do not need to finish your shift today." She straightened slowly. "Yes, I do." He studied her face. "You're exhausted." "That may be true." "You're still cold." "Also true." She met his gaze fully now, not defiant, not timid, simply honest. "But people like me don't get to have dramatic mornings and then disappear to recover from them. The floors still need cleaning either way." The words entered the room without bitterness, which made them sharper. Lorna looked down at the folded napkins in her hands. Ethan did not answer immediately. A man like him was probably used to solving problems with speed. A call, a transfer, a signed instruction. But some things could not be fixed by replacing the object that had been lost. It was the system around the loss that had to be faced. Finally he said, "Then let me at least stop pretending this is normal." Naomi held his eyes for a long second. Something in her softened, not into dependence, but into recognition that he was trying, perhaps for the first time in a very long while, to speak without hiding behind power. "Normal," she said quietly, "is a word people use when something has been unfair for so long it starts to look deserved." The sentence settled over the pantry like warm breath in winter air. Ethan looked at her as if he would remember that line for years. "You should have been in every boardroom I've ever sat in," he said. Naomi gave the faintest shake of her head. "No, sir. I should have been warm this morning." That one landed deeper, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so small, so practical, so devastatingly modest in what it asked of the world. Not admiration, not rescue, just warmth. Just enough human attention for basic suffering to matter before a billionaire walked through the door and named it. Ethan exhaled slowly, the truth of that moving visibly through him. "You're right," he said. "And I'm sorry." Naomi believed him. That was the difficult part. She had heard polished apologies before in life. From supervisors, landlords, men on trains who bumped her shoulder and acted offended by her pain. They usually arrived light and left no mark. This one carried weight because it was not only for the bus stop. It was for the entire morning, for the house, for the habits of a world he had benefited from without fully seeing. She looked down at the new sweater again, then back up. "An apology means more when it changes something," she said. Ethan's expression sharpened, not defensively, but like a man hearing the terms of truth and knowing they were fair. "It will," he said. Footsteps approached in the hall. Mr. Holloway appeared at the pantry entrance, visibly unsure whether he was interrupting a private moment or a restructuring of the universe. "Sir," he said carefully, "your investors have arrived." Ethan did not turn. "Reschedule them." Holloway blinked. "All of them?" "Yes. They flew in from Boston, sir." Ethan finally looked at him. "Then they can fly back with a lesson in patience." The assistant gave a stiff nod and vanished almost instantly. Lorna's mouth twitched, the closest thing to open satisfaction Naomi had ever seen on her face inside this house. Naomi, despite herself, felt a faint warmth that had nothing to do with cashmere. Not triumph, something quieter. The feeling of watching importance finally move in the direction of what was right instead of what was profitable. Ethan picked up the old sweater then, not to take it from her, but to fold it more carefully where it had slipped at the collar. His hands were precise, respectful. "May I ask you something?" he said. Naomi nodded once. "Why did you stop?" She knew what he meant. Why him? Why that bench? Why that night when so many others kept moving? She looked toward the small pantry window, where the last of the snow drifted lightly past the glass. "Because I know what it feels like," she said after a moment. "When people can see you're struggling and decide you're not their problem." The room went still again. Lorna's eyes shone. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, not in shame alone, but in the recognition of a moral debt that numbers could never settle. Naomi reached for the new sweater and this time slipped it on. The cashmere settled around her shoulders like warmth without punishment, softness without sacrifice. She closed her eyes for one brief second at the feel of it, then opened them again, steadier. Ethan watched in silence, and in his face there was no ownership, no self-congratulation, only relief that something cold had finally been answered properly. When Naomi picked up her work rag again, it was not because the moment had ended. It was because her dignity had returned to her in full, and she intended to carry it through the rest of the day. Naomi returned to the foyer a few minutes later. Not smaller, not louder, just steadier. The new sweater rested softly at her shoulders, the old one folded over her arm like a memory she had earned the right to keep. Sunlight had broken through the clouds at last, and thin winter light spilled across the marble in long pale bands. The house was still quiet, but it was a different quiet now. Not the silence of people overlooking her, but the silence that follows when truth has been spoken plainly and cannot be taken back. Ethan Whitmore stood near the front doors, speaking in low tones to his assistant. Yet when Naomi passed, he stopped. No grand gesture this time. No audience, no spectacle. He simply stepped aside to clear her path, as if respect were not something to announce, but something to practice. Naomi paused, just for a second, and looked at him. "Take care of yourself," she said. Ethan's expression softened with something rare and unguarded. "You too, Naomi Carter." She walked on, the wool warm against her skin, the old sweater safe in her arms, and outside the last of the snow began to melt from the hedges in slow, bright drops. Some people spend their whole lives surrounded by luxury and never become gentle. Some have almost nothing, and still leave warmth behind wherever they go. By noon, the house looked the same as it always had. But it wasn't. Somewhere between a bus stop and a marble foyer, kindness had done what power could not. It had made someone finally see.